Get ready for a rough adolescence. It's NES Works episode 132.
Today, he could simply check his horse at the Plaza Hotel and hail a cab.
Well, here we go. The big NES release for spring 1989. By this point, the mere thought of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set kids' mouths frothing with anticipation, and the idea of a great home conversion of Konami's amazing 4-player arcade beat-em-up? My God, that's just amazing. Can you imagine how excited the kids must have been? Poor dumb kids, if only they knew.
If you ever look up the phrase, failing to read the room in a dictionary, the picture next to that definition would be the box art for TMNT for NES. The kids of 1989 loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and they loved the NES. But was this the combination of NES and TMNT that they demanded? Well, no, it was not. Or at least, that's the general consensus among modern fandom. TMNT came to NES courtesy of Ultra Games, which of course is simply the publishing equivalent of a restaurant that no one ever eats at, and clearly operated as a drug front for Konami. Konami, as we all know by now, published an absolute corker of a TMNT game for arcades in 1989, a revolutionary interpretation of the Double Dragon-style walk-and-punch brawler. In arcades, TMNT radically upped the stakes for that genre by integrating gauntlet-style 4-player simultaneous play into the machine, and drenching it in crisp, colorful visuals that perfectly captured the look and tone of the popular TMNT afternoon cartoon. The Ninja Turtles arcade game didn't just look great, it played brilliantly, too. Each of the turtles operated more or less the same, so you could pick your favorite character from the cartoon and not have to worry about failing to keep up with your companions. But they each attacked with their own trademark weapon, which meant that they differed in terms of speed, range, and power. The arcade game's creators wisely understood the force multiplier effect of multiplayer games. If Double Dragon was twice as enjoyable as a co-op experience than when played solo, it stood to reason that further doubling the number of players wading through the scrum at any given time could exponentially increase its amusement value. And they were correct. With its breezy, quarter-gobbling action, vibrant visuals, sampled audio, and chaotically raucous 4-player action, TMNT was a standout arcade release for 1989. One of the primary reasons to visit arcades, and a key contributor, along with Final Fight by Capcom, yes, those guys again, to the way multiplayer brawlers became basically the only thing you could find in arcades for the next 3 years until Street Fighter II, also by Capcom, turned everything into a one-on-one fighting game. This is not that arcade game. It feels like it should be, but the NES wouldn't get a port of the arcade TMNT for another year and a half. And that makes some people very upset. Except that in reality, it's an anachronistic complaint. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles debuted for NES in June 1989, and digging around online, the arcade game doesn't seem to have arrived until October of that year. I'm sure it was in production and presented at various arcade expos, but a quick search suggests that the main amusement vending show for the year, AMOA Expo 1989, didn't take place until September, 3 months after the Turtles had crash-landed on NES. So there wouldn't have been a general awareness of the arcade game until quite some time after this cartridge made its debut. And that lines up with my recollections too. Admittedly, I had never consumed any TMNT media at the point at which Ninja Turtles arrived on NES, but I was always happy to play an appealing-looking video game on NES and in arcades. And I actively sought out the Ninja Turtles game that summer, despite having no real awareness of the licensed property, beyond that it was a cartoon for kids younger than me. But the NES game looked really interesting in Nintendo Power, and that was all that I needed to swallow my mild embarrassment about asking for a kids game. A visually impressive and seemingly complex game from my trusted friends at Ultra? What's not to like? As it happens, TMNT for NES was the first ever appearance of the Ninja Turtles in a video game, and Nintendo Power seized on that fact immediately. TMNT as a TV series had just wrapped its second season of broadcast, which really was the show's first proper season, given that Season 1 consisted of a 5-part miniseries in the time-tested G.I. Joe tradition, and Nintendo pushed the early availability of a tie-in game hard. The game's first mention came all the way back in the second issue of Nintendo Power by way of a brief blurb that announced its arrival about 6 months out. 2 issues later, the magazine published its cover art by way of a teaser, which it followed up on the following issue through a 4-page preview that provided a quick overview of the action and complete maps of stages 1 and 2. The May-June 1989 issue went all in, giving the Turtles the cover story, a 10-page feature that broke out the game mechanics in greater depth. The cover story also took players to the midway point of the adventure, devoting most of its 10 pages to a breakdown of the third stage of 6, a testament to the surprisingly complex design of the game. TMNT would continue to enjoy a long relationship with the magazine, becoming a mainstay of the tips section due to its tricky combination of tremendous popularity and tremendous difficulty. But it also became a feature of the top 30 poll section, and in 1990, it won the magazine's Reader Choice Award for Best Game of 1989. All of this is to say that the narrative that Konami messed up by not bringing the TMNT arcade game to NES right out of the gates, and that TMNT for NES was a repulsive mess that most people hated, is an ahistoric, internet-era exercise in revisionism. The truth is that TMNT was pretty well liked, despite its difficulty. Most kids probably never finished it, but that didn't stop them from playing and enjoying the game. Honestly, I've come to realize that those of us who actually cared about finishing NES games are probably the exact same obsessive nerds who care to contemplate the history and design of NES games 35 years later. For the most part, kids just wanted to pick up cool games, play them for a while until they stopped having fun, then move along to other things. And Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles gave them precisely that opportunity. It allowed kids to play as all 4 of the eponymous Terrapin Warriors, each with their trademark weapons, taking advice from Splinter and April while deflecting taunts from Shredder, and doing battle with familiar foes like Bebop, Rocksteady, Mousers, and more. Was it as effortlessly fun as the arcade game? No, but it still radiated a fundamental TMNT-ness that scratched the itch for kids, especially during those early months in which no other Turtles games were available anywhere else, even in arcades. And for those of us nerds who do care about finishing games before contemplating their history and design, TMNT has a lot to offer. It's a deeply flawed game, but one that occupies an interesting place in video game history. In a lot of ways, it marks the end of an era of NES software design. It might be the last best-selling NES blockbuster to feature an unreasonable difficulty level that largely results from its clumsy, experimental design choices. From this point forward, we'll generally see greater refinement and better balancing in major NES games. TMNT arrives nearly a year out from the Japanese release of Super Mario Bros. 3, a release that ushered in a new mindset among NES developers, or perhaps simply inspired NES players to demand less BS and greater quality in their games. And Super Mario 3 really does mark a sea change for the console. There'll be fewer Castlevania 2s and Amagons and Zelda 2s, games that demand a total investment from players while offering little mercy. Games that practically required a strategy guide to complete. TMNT falls into that quickly vanishing school of game design. This game hates you, and it hates Turtles, and it doesn't have any compunctions about making that fact clear at every opportunity. Still, it comes by that quality through honest means. The NES TMNT legacy really begins with Getsu Fumaden, a Famicom release whose programming codebase reputedly served as the foundation for TMNT. After completing Getsu Fumaden, much of the development team moved along to their next project, Konami YY World. You'll recall that YY World was super charming, featured both licensed and homegrown characters running around in compartmentalized, semi-non-linear stages, and allowed players to swap between multiple characters, each of which had distinct strengths and attack skills. It was also profoundly difficult. This may sound familiar because it's precisely the formula that the TMNT team applied to their own project. But not before a quick stop to create a certain proto-brawler called The Adventures of Bayou Billy, a game also known for its unflinching challenge level. So when it came time to tackle TMNT, the development team fell back on the familiar. They reverted to Getsu Fumaden and YY World mode, building TMNT as a platform action game packed with challenge and set in a collection of stages that players couldn't simply tackle from beginning to end, but instead needed to explore a bit. But why didn't they go the Bayou Billy brawler route and stay in sync with the arcade team's approach, you ask? I can't say for sure, but bear in mind that NES creators at this point had finally realized, after years of hollow coin-op conversions, that arcade and console games demanded fundamentally different forms of play. I wouldn't be surprised if Konami deliberately built the arcade and NES Turtles games to be conspicuously different takes on the same basic concepts. The two games share near identical plot structures, beginning with the abduction of the Turtles' Sensei Splinter and their comrade April O'Neil, and culminating in a fight through the Technodrome to face Shredder. But they both play very differently. Another consideration is that the TMNT property itself, as much as it owed to Japanese media, had zero visibility in Japan when Konami released this game for Famicom. You can see this represented in the way that this Famicom release is the one TMNT game to ship in Japan not under the title of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but rather as Gekikame Ninja Den. That means approximately Awesome Turtle Ninja Legend, but it also resonates, not coincidentally, with the title Getsu Fumiden. But don't take it from me, composer Hidenori Maezawa once told me that the team was at a complete loss when they were handed this overseas property. Why ninjas? Why turtles? Was his summary of the development team's reaction to the TMNT license, and understandably so. Hell, even in the US, early media coverage of the franchise, including Nintendo Powers, generally used gentle puzzlement over the title and premise of the franchise as a starting point for the conversation.
Bad guys. We don't know why they're teenagers. If it looks foolish to you...
And you have to admit, TMNT really is a hell of an unlikely hit. And I don't just mean in terms of the characters, who aren't that much weirder as cartoon heroes go than other 80s mainstays like the Smurfs or Q*bert or whatever. I mean that the Ninja Turtles property as a whole was tossed together mostly as a lark, and its creators never expected it to become an enduring billion-dollar concern. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird created TMNT in 1984 as a self-published black-and-white comic with a press run of about 3,000 copies. The comic looked a bit crude with its scratchy, heavy pen strokes, but something about it resonated with comic buyers of the day, and the initial run sold out immediately. Eastman and Laird's TMNT channeled a lot of different influences of the era, with art and characters reminiscent of Frank Miller's and Dave Sims, minus the weird reactionary misogynistic crankiness of those guys' work. The Ninja Turtles managed a tricky balance between satire and sincerity, simultaneously reading like a piss take on superhero comics of the era, but also as a genuine attempt to depict weirdo sibling warriors trying to live in the shadows of New York City. TMNT successfully captured the outsider dynamics of X-Men, while also goofing directly on Daredevil. The Turtles pretty clearly became mutants in the same accident that replaced Matt Murdock's eyesight with super sonar. It's not for nothing that this quirky, homespun mockery of mainstream cape comics hit around the same time as Marvel's Secret Wars event, the first truly egregious example of a major publisher derailing the creator-centric strides that superhero books had made throughout the 70s and early 80s for the sake of a corporate event. Even if readers didn't necessarily realize it at the time, TMNT offered a stark contrast to the growing cynicism of the mainstream comics industry. Eastman and Laird, for their part, were quick to capitalize on their early success, and TMNT somehow broke into the comics mainstream despite its indie origins. Their Mirage Comics label licensed the property for toys and cartoons, and within 5 years it had become an unlikely juggernaut. The Ninja Turtles arrived on NES just as the franchise went from minor hit to primal pop culture force. The third season of the cartoon, which would comprise nearly 4 dozen episodes, was slated to hit syndication in September, and promotion would begin soon for the following spring's Hollywood adaptation. Archie Comics launched its own line of Turtles stories that hewed to the aesthetics and storyline of the TV series, rather than building on the more serious and frequently more violent Mirage line. Plus, there were all those video games. But it would be a while before TMNT made its way into Japanese media in earnest, and considering the somewhat baffling mandate that had been handed to them, Konami's dev team did a pretty good job of making sense of it. Which brings us at last to the game itself. I knew we'd get there eventually. TMNT for NES takes the form of a platform game with melee combat. Since we didn't actually see Getsu Fumiden or YY World over here, the closest analog in Konami's existing catalog would have been the Castlevania games. But honestly, TMNT doesn't really feel like Castlevania in any meaningful way. The action moves at about the same pace, and it places its focus on short-range melee combat with supplemental ranged attacks, but that's about where the similarities end. The turtles move more nimbly than a Belmont, especially in the air. Sometimes that's to their detriment. The gang's loose, high-flying jumps can be tough to control in tight situations. Several of the game's most notorious sticking points have to do with the turtles' jump physics, including a crucial gap inside of a warehouse where you'll hit your head and lose a bunch of progress if you try to clear it with a normal jump. And the later stages of the game involve a lot of tight passages where you need to leap very precisely over enemy projectiles. Thankfully, TMNT does feature a somewhat forgiving substitute for a traditional lives system. Rather than giving you 1-ups and penalizing you whenever you die, Konami drew from YY World to treat each turtle as a life. That means you have 4 lives, 4 guys, 4 chances. And because each turtle has a separate stamina meter, TMNT gives you a little flexibility in how you manage risk and death than you'd find in your usual NES game. You can change out of your active hero at more or less any time by pulling up the menu screen and swapping characters. So if you find one turtle at the brink of death, you can avoid losing them by switching over to a healthy turtle and treating yourself to a full life bar. This does pose a practical concern though. Each turtle's health status carries forward from stage to stage rather than refilling every time you beat a level, and you can only restore your energy by finding pizza power-ups, and those only benefit the character who actively collects the icon. So if you swap characters around frequently in order to diffuse health damage, you run the risk of entering a difficult stretch of the game with a team of walking wounded who are likely to fall to the next successful enemy attack. The good news is that TMNT allows you to recover a defeated character with far less grinding than YY World did. Rather than charging you a ton of cash to revive a dead hero the way Dr. Spice did, TMNT simply marks a fallen turtle as captive. The enemy holds them as a living prisoner rather than just killing them outright, which means that if you can find the location of a lost turtle, you can return them to your team with their full health restored. A feature reminiscent of freeing imprisoned teens in Maniac Mansion, which would show up on NES at the end of 1990. At the same time that the second TMNT game shipped, as it happened. Switching characters around does have value beyond simply soaking up damage. Each turtle enters combat wielding his own trademark weapon, each of which proves useful at various times. Again, this element appears to be something of a through line in Konami's NES and Famicom output. Heck, before YY World, there was Nightmare 2, Maze of Gallius, and TMNT would be followed by the likes of Castlevania 3, Contra Force, and Animaniacs. Konami was really into this mechanic. It perfectly fits this license, though, giving each turtle both advantages and weaknesses in combat. Donatello's bow staff, for example, offers the greatest reach and delivers the heaviest damage. Great, you think, but the bow staff also has the longest wind-up time and the narrowest hitbox, meaning that it only hits foes directly ahead of and behind Donatello's torso, while leaving him otherwise vulnerable for a dangerously long time. On the other hand, Raphael's Psy attack has a tiny hitbox, but its vigorous attack animation covers a remarkable range of space with that tiny point of impact. And those little daggers deceptively hit with the second most powerful melee force of all the turtles. Michelangelo's nunchaku provide a similar sort of attack with better range, but they hit with less force. And then there's Leonardo, whose katana sweeps in a simple arc and hits with force that, surprisingly, turns out to be as weak as Mike's blunt sticks. Though Leo does get amped up when in critical health condition, delivering 50% bonus damage each hit through, I guess, adrenaline. So it becomes important to strategize about which turtle to use in a given situation. Donatello is terrible against fast-moving foes in tight spaces, but he shines against enemies above or below your current level, and is a reliable damage dealer against the bigger bosses, which tend to attack from a stationary position. Of course, it's a Turtles game, so you may just end up gravitating toward your favorite character regardless of their combat proficiency, using the others as damage sponges in tricky situations. And that's perfectly valid too. You can always supplement a Turtle's combat deficiencies with secondary weapons. You can collect 4 different types of ranged attacks during the course of your adventure, including shuriken, boomerangs, and a special scroll that fires a wide beam of powerful energy. Each time you use one of these secondary weapons, you reduce your inventory stock. But they can be godsends in some of the more vexing or brutal spaces you have to navigate. The scrolls, in particular, are pretty much mandatory for the final sequence, where somehow you need to survive a passageway into Shredder's inner sanctum by fighting through a gauntlet of tough, flying foot soldiers who attack with ranged weapons before facing Shredder himself. Shredder is a frustrating enemy who leaps around the screen firing a weapon that undoes its target's mutation, reducing them to a normal little turtle that crawls helplessly off the screen. Not only an effective one-shot instant kill, but a weirdly heartbreaking one at that. You would somehow have to get in close and hit Shredder about 25 times with Mike's nunchaku, while avoiding the mutagen beam in order to beat the game. Or you could just blast Shredder in the face 5 times with a wide-sweeping energy beam from across the room. So basically, for the weirdo nerds who actually like to finish NES games, TMNT ultimately becomes an exercise in managing health and magic scroll reserve. Granted, in order to face off against Shredder, you actually have to make it to him, and that is no small task. TMNT consists of 6 stages in total, and they're rough going. Worse, you can only continue twice if you let all of your turtles fall in battle, so you have to power through some nasty stuff while managing your limited resources. Or, more likely, exploiting the fact that pizza health pickups respawn every time you zone out of an area. The levels in this game take 2 forms. Stages 2 and 6 are fairly straightforward hell gauntlets that you somehow need to survive despite their non-stop barrage of damaging obstacles. The others, however, have an almost RPG-like structure. You navigate maps from an overhead viewpoint and duck into doors and sewer manholes, which lead to the side-scrolling action sequences. The side-scrolling spaces, which span interiors, sewers, rooftops, and caverns, sometimes exist as simple linkages between sections of the overhead maps, and sometimes contain mission objectives. After Stage 2, the turtles acquire their Party Wagon van, which allows them to zip around the map while blasting enemies and barriers alike with missiles. The free-scrolling nature of the overhead maps gives the individual levels an almost Metroidvania-like feel. Almost. You need to explore and hunt for the path forward, but the only navigational power-up you need to acquire during the course of your adventure is a rope that allows you to walk between rooftops. The dead-end spaces throughout stages 1 and 3 through 5 work out to be pretty much just that, dead ends. They do sometimes grant the opportunity to grab power-ups and rescue lost turtles, but for the most part you really just want to determine the fastest route from start to finish in each stage and make a beeline for the boss in order to minimize the damage you soak up along the way. Of course, that's more easily said than done in Stage 5, one of the most vexing sequences on NES. The 5th level of Ninja Turtles sends you through a brutal gauntlet of caverns packed with enemies in a frustrating search for Shredder's Technodrome base. At first glance, the Technodrome assault doesn't seem all that different from any other TMNT level. If anything, it looks more forgiving than the bewildering sprawl of Stage 4's utterly enormous map. The unpleasant plot twist comes when you realize that the Technodrome appears randomly in one of several caverns, and you have no way of determining which one it's spawned in for this play session until you find it. So Stage 5 amounts to a lot of wandering into dead ends, and losing tons of health and resources to the absolutely vicious army of foot warriors that populate the caverns, wearing you down before the eventual Technodrome fight and the relentless 6th and final stage. It's a witheringly difficult game, and, like Blaster Master, it can be deeply demoralizing when you spend a couple of hours fighting your way to the end only to run out of continues after taking a cheap shot from the final boss. But it had just enough turtle power to it that the kids of '89 were willing to power through, or at least to play until they saw their final game over. Besides the obvious franchise markers like the palpably distinct Quartet of Heroes, their allies Splinter and April, and of course Shredder and the Technodrome, TMNT features enough recognizable bits as seen on TV to feel authentic. Granted, familiar faces like Mauser robots and Foot Clan soldiers mingle freely with random enemies like dudes made of fire and bizarre combat armadillos. But you face bosses like Bebop and Rocksteady, a mecha turtle and a giant Mauser, while chomping pizza and blasting your way through the city in the Party Wagon. So despite the fact that the game owes more aesthetically to the Mirage comics, from the drab hunched designs of the foot soldiers to the single-colored masks the turtles wear and the box art, it still fired off more than enough endorphins to appeal to kids immersed in their Archie comics and Playmates figures and latchkey afternoon tunes. At the very least, it would do until the arcade game came along and captured the look of the cartoon more perfectly. And for those of us looking back on NES history, TMNT really feels like the end of an era. Besides being one of the very last high-profile NES games to take a no-prisoner approach to difficulty balancing, with its sometimes clumsy and obtuse mechanics, it's also perhaps the last truly big licensed NES game to take an experimental, gameplay-first approach to design. TMNT has more in common with early licensed titles like Rambo and the Goonies 2, than with, say, DuckTales or Gremlins 2. That is to say, despite undeniably having been crafted around the property's characters, TMNT for NES feels like a video game first and a licensed property second. It's challenging, evolutionary, and unapologetic in a way that connects it to Konami's earlier work. In fact, it was the blockbuster success of this game and the TMNT arcade game that initiated a massive transformation in game design philosophy at Konami. Castlevania creator Hitoshi Akamatsu has said, via Shmuplations of course, that the success of the Turtles games, beginning with this one, caused Konami to drop plans for further Castlevania sequels on NES. And you really can see a change in Konami's design philosophy in the wake of TMNT's success. They'd continue to create technically brilliant games with beautiful graphics and rock-solid gameplay. Their era of freewheeling invention comes to an end here, in favor of guaranteed crowd pleasers and eager attempts to find the next big licensed hit. Konami had totally lucked in designing the TMNT license before it truly took off, and they would try for years to strike indie breakout gold again, with the likes of Zen the Intergalactic Ninja, Bucky O'Hare, and the Cowboys of Moo Mesa. Yeah, anyway, TMNT for NES has a relatively bleak reputation among NES fans these days for its rough design and for not being the arcade game. But the real reason to resent its existence is for the way that it changed Konami. But why take the negative view? Let's celebrate it for what it is. One of the last truly out there licensed 8-bit games to emerge from the fertile Famicom development scene of the late 1980s. A weird and ungainly interpretation of a bewildering license by a small team of creative and ambitious designers who adapted the property without any particular corporate oversight or the need to adhere to a style guide, or a mandate to color within the lines for a guaranteed million seller. TMNT can be a little hard to love these days without emulator save states or a rebalancing ROM hack, but the fact that it was allowed to be so ugly, so unhinged, and so inventive in the first place makes it the last bastion of a better era, or at least a less corporate one anyway.
Next time on NES Works, they say war is hell, but after that rough Technodrome gauntlet, it kind of sounds like a nice vacation.